Bangladesh, a nation brimming with youthful energy, found itself at a crossroads in recent times. Student protests, once a rare occurrence, erupted across the country. The trigger? A deeply flawed quota system for government jobs. This system, designed to uplift disadvantaged communities, had morphed into a tool of injustice. It reserved a significant portion of positions for the descendants of war veterans, a policy spanning decades. The students' grievances were clear. The quota system was inherently unfair, favouring lineage over merit. It shut out a vast majority of talented young people from opportunities. These students, armed with degrees and aspirations, saw their futures clouded by an archaic system. They demanded a level playing field, a system that rewarded talent and hard work, not birthright. The protests began as small gatherings, whispers of discontent growing louder with each passing day. Students, frustrated with limited prospects, found their voice. University campuses transformed into hubs of dissent, buzzing with passionate debates and calls for change. The demand was simple yet powerful, a fair chance to shape their own destinies. The government's response to the burgeoning student movement was swift and brutal. Instead of addressing the legitimate concerns raised by the students, the authorities chose the path of repression. Riot police descended upon peaceful demonstrations, wielding batons and tear gas with impunity. Images of bloodied students and tear gas-filled streets flooded social media, sparking outrage and disbelief. Arrests became commonplace. Student leaders, the voices of the movement, were targeted and detained without cause. Reports of torture and ill treatment within the labyrinthine detention centres sent chills down the spines of citizens. The government's message was clear. Dissent would be crushed, no matter the cost. The crackdown, far from quelling the protests, only served to strengthen the students' resolve. The violence unleashed upon them fueled their anger and determination. The spirit of resistance, once dormant, had been awakened. The students, now more united than ever, vowed to continue their fight for justice. In the face of state-sponsored censorship and a media blackout, social media emerged as a lifeline for the student protesters. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter and WhatsApp became virtual megaphones, amplifying their voices and broadcasting their struggle to a global audience. Hashtags related to the protests trended worldwide, drawing attention to the plight of these young Bangladeshis. Social media played a pivotal role in mobilizing support for the movement. Students, tech-savvy and interconnected, used these platforms to organize protests, disseminate information and bypass traditional media channels. Real-time updates, photos and videos of the protests, often captured on smartphones, provided irrefutable evidence of the government's brutality, countering the state-sponsored narrative. Beyond Bangladesh's borders, the diaspora community, connected through these digital threads, rallied to the cause. They organized demonstrations in foreign capitals, lobbied their elected officials, and kept the international spotlight firmly focused on the unfolding crisis. Social media, once dismissed as a tool of trivial pursuits, had become a potent weapon in the fight for justice and democracy. The brutal crackdown on student protesters in Bangladesh drew swift and widespread condemnation from the international community. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, documented numerous cases of human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, torture, and enforced disappearances. The United Nations, through its various bodies, expressed deep concern over the deteriorating human rights situation in Bangladesh and urged the government to exercise restraint and engage in dialogue with the protesters. The United States, the European Union, and other Western governments echoed these sentiments, calling for an end to the violence and respect for fundamental freedoms. The international pressure, while significant, had a limited impact on the Bangladeshi government, which remained defiant in the face of criticism. The authorities dismissed the allegations of human rights abuses as fabricated and politically motivated, accusing foreign governments of interfering in its internal affairs. Section 5, Beyond the Quotas, a Deeper Discontent. While the flawed quota system served as the immediate catalyst for the protests, the student movement soon evolved into a broader expression of discontent with the ruling regime. The protests reflected a deep-seated frustration with corruption, lack of accountability, and shrinking space for dissent in Bangladesh. Students, at the forefront of this movement, voiced concerns that resonated with millions of ordinary citizens. They demanded a more just and equitable society, where opportunities were not determined by birth or connections. They called for an end to endemic corruption, which had crippled the nation's institutions and stifled economic growth. The protests, in essence, were a cry for dignity and a rejection of the status quo. They represented a yearning for a better future, a future where the voices of the young and the marginalized were heard and respected. The students, through their courage and sacrifice, had ignited a spark of hope in the hearts of many. Section 6. A government on the defensive promises and crackdowns. Faced with mounting international pressure and unrelenting protests, the Bangladeshi government adopted a two-pronged strategy, making superficial concessions while simultaneously continuing its crackdown on dissent. The authorities announced a review of the quota system, promising reforms to address some of the students' concerns. However, these promises rang hollow as the government continued to target and silence critical voices. Journalists covering the protests faced intimidation, harassment, and even physical attacks. Human rights defenders and activists were branded as enemies of the state, subject to surveillance, arbitrary detention, and trumped-up charges. The government's duplicity only fueled the flames of discontent. The students, recognizing the government's attempts to placate them with empty promises, refused to back down. They vowed to continue their struggle until meaningful reforms were implemented and those responsible for the violence against protesters were held accountable. Section 7. Uncertain Horizons, the future of the protests. As the sun sets on another day of protests in Bangladesh, the future of the student movement hangs in the balance. The government, despite its initial attempts at appeasement, appears determined to crush dissent and maintain its grip on power. The students, on the other hand, remain defiant, their spirit unbroken despite facing immense pressure and intimidation. The outcome of this struggle will likely depend on several factors, including the unity and resilience of the protest movement, the level of international pressure on the Bangladeshi government, and the willingness of the authorities to engage in meaningful dialogue and implement genuine reforms. The coming days and weeks will be crucial. The world watches with bated breath, hoping that reason will prevail, and that the dreams and aspirations of a generation will not be drowned out by the forces of oppression. Section 8. A defining moment, democracy at a crossroads. The student protests in Bangladesh represent a defining moment for the country's fragile democracy. They serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of democratic institutions and the importance of safeguarding fundamental freedoms. The government's response to the protests will have far-reaching consequences, shaping the country's political landscape for years to come. If the government chooses the path of continued repression, it risks further alienating its citizens and pushing the country deeper into authoritarianism. On the other hand, if the government heeds the calls for reform and engages in meaningful dialogue with the students and other stakeholders, it can begin to heal the rifts in society and build a more just and equitable Bangladesh. The international community has a responsibility to stand with the people of Bangladesh during this critical juncture. This includes holding the government accountable for its human rights obligations, providing support to civil society organizations and human rights defenders, and using diplomatic channels to urge the government to choose the path of dialogue and reform. The future of Bangladesh hangs in the balance. The world watches, hoping that the sacrifices of the students will not be in vain, and that a brighter, more democratic future